and thanks for tuning in. My name's Katie and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Old Treasury Building. This is a webinar format. You're all safe. We can't see or hear you, but if you do have any technical difficulties, just put a comment in the chat and I'll help you. As we go along, if you have any questions for our speaker, please place them in the Q&A and they'll be addressed towards the end. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that the Old Treasury Building, where we're presenting from today, is located on the lands of the Kulin Nations. We pay our respects to the traditional custodians, past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded. Now I'll pass you over to Margaret Anderson. Margaret is the Director of the Old Treasury Building and was lead on the team to research and curate our Lost Jobs, The Changing World of Work exhibition, now on display in the museum until the end of 2023. Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you, Katie, very much. And welcome, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. Before I start, what I'm going to do, if I can get my machine to cooperate, I'm going to stop my video so that you don't have me sticking up in the corner there. And also it reduces the amount of data that we're drawing in this lovely old heritage building of ours. So I'll do that now and I'll begin the talk. So what we're speaking about today is the world of work in the city and how this has changed. So we've just opened a new exhibition at the Old Treasury Building called Lost Jobs, The Changing World of Work. It's about the kind of work that people did in the past and how that changed in the period from about the 1840s right up until the present. And one of the places where we see those changes most obviously is right here in the city of Melbourne itself. Our city is a forest of tall buildings, and many of them are office towers. Before COVID, at least, they were all full of office workers beavering away from 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. When we think of the modern city, we probably think of offices first and foremost, and then of the businesses that support them. The stationers, the booksellers, the cafes, the department stores, the transport networks that ferry workers in and out of the city over a working day. To a large extent, the rhythms of the modern city revolve around the office. But in the past, workplaces in the city were far more diverse than this. They included many factories, hundreds of smaller workshops, stables, dairies, and armies of cartmen ferrying goods and people. How's this for an early traffic jam? Not bad, is it? Some seriously noxious industries were spread along the riverbanks, along with flour mills, paper mills, and other industries that needed water. And thousands of workers also lived in the city within walking distance of their work. This was a very different city from the one we know today. It was a low-rise rather than a high-rise city, but it was jam-packed with people. It would have sounded very different, and it would have smelt very different too. Let's start with the streets themselves. In the 19th century, lots of people earned a living on the street. We can see some of them in this marvellous picture painted by Nicolas Chevalier in 1862. Now I'm just going to get a little laser pointer going here so that I can point some things out for you. It's called the English Mail Day at the Post Office, Melbourne, and it shows a huge crowd gathered outside the post office to collect mail that had obviously just arrived by ship. Around the edges of the picture are various workers. Now, if you look at the pictures from left to right, let's begin with this man, a man with a covered wheeled cart. From his dress, in a black frock coat and top hat, he looks almost as if he might be a conjurer or some sort of entertainer. Then next to him is a man kneeling on two planks set against the pavement. He seems to be selling packets of goods here on the pavement. The child next to the woman in the blue jacket here is clutching something to his chest, perhaps something his mother has just bought him from the cellar. Behind and just to the right is another man in a top hat who seems to be handing out bills of some kind. Perhaps it's advertising material. And in front of him is a man leaning up against a desk. He seems to be writing, and he has two men in front of him, one of whom is Chinese. Perhaps the man leaning on the desk is writing a letter for the Chinese man. There's another similar desk to the right over here, which may be another two letter writers. When a sizable proportion of the population was functionally illiterate, and by that I mean that people could very often write their names and probably they could spell out enough words, maybe even work through a newspaper, but not necessarily have the ability to write a letter themselves. And so letter writers were in strong demand. And a spot just outside the post office was probably an excellent place to be, especially on mail day, perhaps. In the foreground are three newsboys, 1, 2, 3. You can see them there, each with a bundle of folded papers under one arm and waving out the day's paper under the noses of passers-by. And finally, there's a man here holding a horse's head while a gentleman dismounts. He will probably hold the horse while the man collects his letters. So all in all, in this picture, we can see some 10 workers here in this scene, at least 3 of them children. And along with what may be a child picking pockets just here on the edge of the crowd. Now, I'll leave the pointer out of the way for now. Melbourne streets were busy workplaces throughout the 19th century. A huge range of goods was sold by street traders, known then as hawkers. They sold just about everything: flowers, fruit, vegetables, fish, oysters, saveloys, milk, bread, muffins, patent medicines, pins, matches, and even birds. Here's the cockatoo hawker in Melbourne in 1887. After the gold rush, some of the hawkers were Chinese men, often selling fruit and vegetables from market gardens on the outskirts of the city. Some sold door to door, others simply wandered the streets selling, but they made an important contribution to especially poorer people who were able to buy fresh fruit and vegetables from the costermongers, as they were sometimes called, at lower prices than from the shops. From time to time, opposition to these so-called foreign traders would bubble up, and the Chinese hawkers could be set upon and beaten, but they persisted. In the early 1850s, there were probably less than 100 hawkers altogether in the city, but the number quickly increased until by the end of the century, there were nearly 1,000. The council tried to regulate these sellers from the 1860s, insisting that they have a license. They also tried to restrict adult traders to those who were elderly or infirm and unable to work elsewhere. And in the exhibition, we have a wonderful letter written by one such man pleading for a license. James O'Meara or O'Mara could read and write just. His spelling was strictly phonetic, but we get a clear picture of a desperate man unable because of rheumatism to earn a living in any other way. He asked for permission to sell fruit and vegetables from a fixed stand, and his letter has survived in the state archives. Now, those who traded without a license could be arrested for obstructing the pavement or for vagrancy, and that was what happened to 2 little boys. Now, bring the pointer out again. Here they are. Their story was told in the newspaper with an illustration. Here they are here. They were brothers. One played a tune on a tin whistle and danced, while his brother beat time on a kettle drum. When they were brought before the magistrate at the city police court, it was revealed that they were the sole supporters of their widowed mother and 3 other children. In circumstances like these, it was common for children to be charged as neglected children and sent to industrial schools. But these children were allowed to return to the streets. And we've wondered if that was because the magistrate was loath to commit all 5 children to the schools and have all 5 as a charge on the state. Instead, the magistrate encouraged the little boys to go to school at night. You can imagine how likely that was. There were many such children, mostly boys, but also some girls, although there was very strong disapproval of girls selling on the street, especially at night, when they were felt to be in great moral danger. And undoubtedly they were. We know from the records of court cases involving neglected children that poor girls were subject to constant harassment in the city. And one such story was reported in the Argus in 1881. It quoted one senior constable, McHugh, who arrested a man for, quote, following and making improper overtures to 2 evening newspaper girls, the eldest of whom was only 11 years old. But, he adds, it was found on inquiry that the girls had already fallen into immoral habits at the age of 11. Thank you very much. So presumably the man was then released. Some girls sold flowers or matches on the streets, and the little flower girl in particular became quite a character in popular culture in the times. Popular songs and paintings represented her in a romantic light, but the reality was likely to be anything but. These children usually lived in abject poverty, and you can see the clothing of this little mite, all ripped and torn and very worn. They stood for hours on street corners or outside theatres trying to sell their wares, and most earned very little. And as you can imagine, as the day went on, no doubt the flowers they were selling became more and more wilted. Few of them ever went to school. But most of the street traders were boys, including most of the flower sellers. By all accounts, they could be quite a rowdy bunch, and not a few of them finished up in court on one charge or another, including stealing flowers from public gardens. This photograph of flower sellers on Prince's Bridge, taken in about 1903, also suggests that they varied in age from youths to quite young lads. You can see these little fellows over here, maybe 10, 11, 12, hard to judge, isn't it? Whereas these quite grown up, and several men in the background there too. Their earnings varied too. Some seem to have managed to earn about 15 shillings per week, which was about the same as the street sweepers earned. But others might earn as little as 5 shillings. It was enough to help out at home, but not enough to live on. Before the 1870s, many children also worked as bootblacks in the city. Bootblacks needed very little equipment and could practice their trade almost anywhere. Melbourne streets, of course, were notoriously dusty in summer and muddy in winter, and the bootblacks seemed to have found plenty of work. They tended to congregate in areas like Burke Street, near the theatres, restaurants, and wine salons. By later in the century, older men increasingly replaced the boys, probably once the authorities began policing the 1872 Education Act more strenuously. And some men are known to have worked a particular spot, which was known as a pitch, for years. Michael Darcy was one who started shining shoes in 1864 and worked outside Stutz Hotel on the corner of Burke and Russell Streets for the next 35 years. But it was the fish hawkers who were said to make the best living on the streets of Melbourne. These were men who sold their fish from barrows. Apparently, hygiene was not a huge priority. They were said to clean their fish in the city's horse troughs. Lovely. Then at the end of the day, many simply dumped their slimy load of scales and fish entrails into the gutters. They seem to have done a roaring trade though, so presumably they didn't kill too many of their customers. Unlike one of the ice cream sellers in Collingwood, who did indeed poison a customer in 1918. It transpired later that he'd made his ice cream using a can of condensed milk that he'd opened 12 days earlier. And remember that this is before refrigeration, domestic refrigeration, was very commonly available. Many street sellers advertised their trade by calling out their wares, and the cries of the hawkers was one of the sounds of the city in the 19th century. Some might remember that it continued well into the 20th century in the figure of the Newsboys. but by then, most of their fellows had gone. At the end of the century, the Melbourne City Council decided that it was time to rid the city of its army of hawkers. Shopkeepers and residents all complained about the noise they made and the mess they left behind at the end of each day. They were banished first to Prince's Bridge, and you can see the fish hawkers here in 1910, which must have been extremely crowded for a while, and then they were banned altogether. The exception was the newsboy, who persisted for many decades. Newsboys were a common sight in the city until well into the 20th century. Despite the 1872 Education Act, there were many boys and a few girls, as we heard, who worked long hours on street corners selling newspapers. And here they are collecting their papers from the Argus office at 7 o'clock in the morning. As they worked, they called out the headlines, and the calls of the newsboys were one of the sounds of the city for many years. Often they could work all day and well into the evening. In fact, the evening rush hour was their busiest time. As offices emptied of workers for the day and shoppers headed home, the city newsboy darted in and out of the crowds and in and out of the traffic, thrusting his papers into the hands of passers-by. Not surprisingly, accidents involving newsboys were fairly common, and sometimes they were even fatal. Many of these children had little or no schooling, and a proportion of them were also homeless. Others came from poor homes where they might be the main breadwinner. Over the years, various attempts were made to regulate conditions for the newsboys, but they met with very little success. One society that was especially important in helping the newsboys was the Newsboys Tri-Society, later known as the City Newsboys Society. It was established in the late 1880s by a man named Peter Forster, a committed child rescuer, as they were known, and city boys paid a nominal membership fee to join. From 1897, Forster was helped by a remarkable woman, Miss Edith Onions, who went on to run the society until her death in 1955. Effectively, she devoted her life to the cause of the boys. By the turn of the 20th century, the society had managed to kit out an impressive headquarters with both educational and recreational facilities. Poor city boys could also get a hot meal in the club rooms and a bath. Every year, the society ran a newsboys picnic, which was catered by charity and was keenly anticipated by the boys. They also served a full Christmas dinner and gave each boy a Christmas present. From the early 1900s, legislation effectively placed a night curfew on all child traders, but a morning or evening paper round continued to be an important source of extra income for working class boys well into the 1950s, as you can see here. But let's leave the streets themselves and look at other ways people earned a living in or near the city. One of the most obvious features of the 19th century city was the number of chimneys or smokestacks that could be seen. You can see them here. Until well into the 20th century, most industry was powered by steam, and smokestacks from these workshops and factories were a dominant feature of the city's skyline. This isometric engraving of Melbourne in 1882 shows the smokestacks of many workshops then located within what is now the CBD. And there were hundreds more located in the nearby industrial suburbs of Fitzroy, Collingwood, Richmond, South Melbourne, North Melbourne, and Footscray. Most factory workers also lived in the city, within walking distance of their work. The kinds of factories varied over time. From the mid-19th century, there were soap making and paper making works along the river, along with wool washing, glue works, tallow works, and other industries that needed access to water. The effluent from these works went straight into the Yarra, and the river was heavily polluted as early as the 1850s. One woman who arrived in Melbourne from Quebec in 1853 described the Yarra as a filthy little muddy stream, much polluted by wool washing and other noxious industries. Her name was Mrs. A. Campbell. And compared to the mighty St. Lawrence River that she was used to, that observation is not surprising. And over time, the noxious industries only increased. Heavy industry tended to be concentrated around the area of the port and then along the Maribyrnong, where a local chemical industry also emerged. Clothing and textiles, boots and shoes, and food and drink factories were other early industries in the city. These workshops employed both male and female workers. In the early clothing factories, everything was still made by hand. Women were often employed to sew the long seams and to do the fiddly finishing work. Children also did this work, and you can see some children here, some of them looking particularly tired if we assume that's what's happening with this little girl. And they often worked the same long hours as adults. A 10-hour day was common in early factories, even for children. There are references to children as young as 9 starting work in some factories. The factory owners often preferred to employ women and children when they could, because they had to pay them less. Until after the Second World War, the going rate for women was just over half the male rate of pay, even when women did much the same work as men. But generally, jobs were regarded as either men's or women's jobs and were paid accordingly. At first, this was an informal arrangement within each industry, but later, wages boards and then the arbitration court formalised the classifications. The only exceptions were for some trades, especially during the Second World War, when higher wages were offered to women to persuade them to work in the factories. But that offer never extended to the traditional areas of women's work, in clothing, textiles, and food factories, despite the importance of those industries to the war effort. From the 1860s, we begin to see the introduction of machinery to clothing factories. Women generally managed these machines, but ironically, this was regarded as less skilled work. The tasks considered to require the highest level of skill were reserved for men. In the tailoring trade, they included cutting out, fitting, some finishing, hand finishing tasks, and pressing. The heavy tailor's pressing irons were thought to be far too heavy for women to operate. And you can see a man, I think these men here are operating the tailor's irons. Women could qualify as tailoresses, though that was different from being a tailor. It was a shorter apprenticeship and they were taught only part of the trade. Ironically, it was the tailoresses who formed the first successful female union in Victoria in 1882. The Tailoresses Association led a successful strike in 1883 against employers who were trying to reduce piece rates, and they remained a strong force in the union movement until amalgamation with the Tailors' Society in 1906. In this engraving, made of the workshop at Haymanson's clothing factory in 1867, the distinct male and female tasks are clearly visible. The tailors are the men on the right, sitting on the floor cross-legged by the windows, see the windows, to the right of the picture. Women can be seen sewing seams by machine in the centre of the room, while the women standing to their left seem to be doing a range of tasks, maybe piecing garment pieces together. On the far left, men can be seen at the cutting out table, and you can see the big tailor shears here. Haymanson's factory was in Elizabeth Street. Sometimes industries clustered together in the city. This was true of Flinders Lane, which for decades was associated with boots and shoes and with clothing and textiles, known popularly as the rag trade. From the 19th century until at least the 1960s, and this is a factory room in the 1920s, the street was thronged with clothing workshops from high-end fashion houses to the makers of what was known as shoddy, which is probably what we're looking at here. Cheap, ready-to-wear garments made for working people. Streets intersecting with Flinders Lane often housed associated workshops and retailers, and that was reflected in the names they had. Manchester Lane, for example, which connects Flinders Lane with Collins Street between Swanston and Elizabeth Streets, was once home to many fabric warehouses that supplied the garment factories. And workers lived in the narrow tenements, you can see some of them here, that grew up along the little streets, lanes and alleys. As the city grew more crowded, it became increasingly difficult to manage deliveries in and out of Flinders Lane, and the workshops began to move further out. But it was the end of tariff protection in the 1970s, just as Asian markets were beginning to take off, that really spelled the end of Melbourne's rag trade. The Australian industry simply couldn't compete with cheap imports flooding the market. The same was true of the many boot and shoe factories. By the end of the 1970s, Flinders Lane was a dismal place of empty workrooms and derelict buildings. It took decades for it to transform itself into the cafe restaurant precinct it is today, only to be decimated all over again by COVID in our own time. In the period from the late 19th century until about the 1960s, the other major sector of industry in the city was the food, drink and confectionery trade. There were several large factories, including Hoadley's, that occupied a city block in South Melbourne on what is now South Bank. But the largest was a huge complex of buildings in North Fitzroy that housed the McRobertson Confectionery Factory, known as the Great White City because its buildings were all painted white. The McRobertson's complex spread over 30 acres and employed thousands of workers. Like the clothing trade, McRobertson and other food manufacturers employed large numbers of women and girls, although there is no hint that McRobertson employed underage girls. In fact, he was supportive of the Female Confectioners Union, which was formed in one of his workshops, actually, and he adopted what was known as a closed shop, which meant that he employed only union labour. McRobertson was famously a self-made man who began making sweets in the 1880s in his mother's boiler. By the 1920s and 30s, he was the largest manufacturer of chocolates in the Southern Hemisphere and was busily expanding into international markets. Now, another very different manufacturing industry that began life in the city and inner suburbs was motor vehicle manufacturing. It began with a local company, the Tarrant Engineering Company, which from 1901 was based in South Melbourne. There were other premises in Lygon Street. The Tarrant motor car was the first vehicle with an internal combustion engine to be manufactured in Australia. And here it is, the Chandler family, very proud of their new machine. But competition from international firms was fierce from the very beginning. And despite protection, local firms found it very hard to compete. Most concentrated on making car bodies, importing engines from large makers like Ford or General Motors. During the 1920s and 30s, local manufacturer Holden's established a strong market share. And I expect you all know the story of Australia's own car. After the Second World War, the Australian government supported the production of the Holden car, produced in association with General Motors, and produced from the factory in Fisherman's Bend. By the 1950s, Holden models had secured 40% of the vehicle market. Another large vehicle factory was established by Ford in Geelong. Now, you can judge the importance of manufacturing overall in Melbourne by the fact that in 1951, it employed 40% of wage earners in the city and suburbs. 40%. That's a huge proportion. Much of this came tumbling down in the 1970s. It was argued that tariff protection had made Australian industry inefficient and that it had failed to adapt. That was partly true, although in fact industry had abandoned the inner city well before this in an attempt to modernise plants and become more efficient. From the 1950s, companies began to move their plants out of the city and the inner suburbs to large greenfield sites on the outer fringes of Melbourne. Their workers had no choice but to follow, and suburbs like Fitzroy, Collingwood and Richmond were depopulated. We've already seen what happened in Flinders Lane, and it was much the same story elsewhere. Derelict factory sites dotted these suburbs, along with empty workers' housing. It would be nearly 2 decades before the developers moved in and began the warehouse and other conversions that ultimately gentrified the inner suburbs. And it took even longer in the city itself. But eventually, large developments in Docklands and along South Bank began to transform the city. And meanwhile, the outer suburbs expanded, all made possible by the motorcar. Workers no longer walked to work or rode bicycles. Now they drove, and factories provided huge car parks for their workers, who travelled backwards and forwards from dormitory suburbs. Working couples often needed to own 2 cars. But as industry began to falter in the absence of tariff protection, life in these outer suburbs became increasingly fragile. The 1970s saw a toxic combination of high global inflation, escalating oil prices, increasing pressure from a booming Asian market, and the winding up of protection. Some 3,000 factories closed their doors between 1973 and 1980, throwing hundreds of thousands out of work. And this trend continued. By 2001, manufacturing employed just 16% of workers. By 2016, it was a mere 7.8%. Remember that in 1951, it was 40%. And equivalent jobs have been slow to emerge. Meanwhile, Victoria, like the rest of Australia, realised its vulnerability in the face of the COVID pandemic, as literally everything, from vaccines to face masks, had to be imported with long delays. In the decades from the 1960s, the city of Melbourne was largely left to the office worker. And just as often office work dominated employment, so the offices themselves dominated the city's built fabric. The ascent of the city was a gradual affair beginning in the 1890s, but by the millennium, Melbourne was decidedly a high-rise city. The ascent of the city and the growth of the office proceeded hand in hand. So let's look a bit at the world of the office worker. Like every other workplace, the nature of office work has changed hugely over the decades. 2 themes stand out amongst all the processes that shaped this transformation: technology and gender. Nowhere was the impact of technology more profound than in the office, while the gendered nature of office work was shaped and reshaped alongside the technological revolution. For almost all of the 19th century, offices were small and all records were kept by hand. Clerks of various grades were employed to do this work. All were men. Although it's clear that some women helped their husband with business at home, when it came to the office, it was a male-only workplace. Clerks were employed to write letters. These men were known as letter writers, and to copy letters, known as copyists. They kept ledgers, ledger keepers, and accounts, bookkeepers, then accountants. A legible hand was paramount for all of these jobs, and children were taught handwriting at school until at least the 1960s. It was a great skill, and the ability to write in a good copperplate script was prized. Here is an exercise book that belonged to one little girl, Everil Fisher, in 1912. Even over a century later, these documents are still clearly legible. At the bottom of the office hierarchy was the messenger boy, who was employed to run messages within the office, between offices, and to and from the post office or other business premises. Before other means of communication, this was a quicker alternative to the formal letter. And in some offices, the messenger boy also made the tea. Now, office work was so-called white-collar work, reserved for those with some education. And initially, office hours were not long, as befitted the lives of gentlemen. For most of the 19th century, hours of work seem to have been from 10 to 4, with an hour's break for lunch. Hardly taxing in our terms, although they did work Saturday mornings as well. Records were all kept in pen and ink, using a dip pen for the most part. Although fountain pens were beginning to be used from the 1850s, they were not mass-produced until some decades later. School children were taught to use a dip pen from about the 3rd grade, and that continued until the 1960s, when the Viro finally made dip pens redundant, not without resistance from writing specialists. If it's confession time, I should say that I was taught to write with a dip pen, complete with the upstroke and darker downstroke that you see here, that were characteristic of this writing style. That was in the early 1960s. I can't remember when we were finally allowed to write with biros, but it was a momentous day. No more messy ink blots, smudges, you can see some here, or overflowing inkwells, but no more copperplate writing either. Technology began the revolution in the office from the late 19th century, when several machines changed office processes forever. The first came with the telegraph in the late 1850s, although the telegraph did not invade the office itself. That came with the telephone and then the typewriter, both inventions of the last 3 decades of the 19th century. The telephone came to Melbourne very early, in the late 1870s, very soon after it was patented in the United States. At first, telephones were installed as private lines between business premises, but from 1880, there was a general telephone exchange. This service actually predated the first such exchange in London, and historians have suggested that Melbourne's vision of itself at this time as an up-to-date modern city may partly explain this early adoption of the telephone. At first, each call had to be connected manually via a switchboard that was usually called an exchange. Like the first railways, the first telephone exchanges were operated by private companies. But it was soon obvious that telephones required a lot of infrastructure, and government took over the provision through the post office from 1887. Thereafter, their use spread rapidly and soon included private subscribers. Early telephones, of course, looked very different. Here are some models. And the first telephone exchange was tiny, little more than a cupboard, known as the telephone room at the Melbourne Exchange. This painting was done by Julian Ashton in 1881, so right at the beginning. But of course, they soon expanded to require different exchanges for local calls and so-called trunk calls, connections interstate and overseas. Here is the Will Street Exchange for trunk calls in 1910. From the very beginning, operating telephones and working in telephone exchanges was seen as suitable employment for women. Naturally, it was immediately classified as women's work and paid at a lower rate than other office work, with little opportunity for promotion. But still, there was always a demand for the work, which was no doubt better than standing all day in a shop. Although, in fact, going back to the Julian Ashton painting, the early exchange operators seem to have worked standing, but this soon changed. At first, a business might have only one telephone line installed, usually associated with the manager's office. But that didn't last long. Soon there were so many telephones that businesses needed to install their own switchboards to manage all the calls. Now, just going back to the slide you can see in front of you at the moment, 1930, the central telephone exchange. I particularly enjoy this photograph, not only for the long line of women, but also for the man in charge supervising here. He at least has to stand all day while they sit. Soon there were so many telephones that businesses needed to install their own switchboards to manage all the calls. And these were managed by women too. Here is the Mackay-Massey switchboard in Sunshine in 1949, and it was operated by one Miss Joan Howard, shown here. The other machine to invade the office in the late 19th century was, of course, the typewriter. This was first marketed in America in the 1870s, but at first businesses were very slow to adopt the typewriter. They worried that typed letters were impersonal, and they were concerned about the possibility of forgeries. But sheer efficiency soon won out, and typewriters then spread rapidly. The day of the hand copyist was over, because very soon typewriters could also make copies. Some of these men might have retrained to be the first so-called typewriters. The users of typewriting machines were known first. And for some time, both boys and girls learned to type at the several business colleges operating in Melbourne. In fact, in this photograph of Stotts Business College in 1910, there seemed to be more boys than girls. But business soon learned that it could save money by employing women as typewriters. And a new term emerged to describe these women, typists. Typists were unarguably women, and soon there were lots of them in offices throughout the city. They were employed by government too, but only in these limited roles and with very few promotional options. Although the Victorian Public Service never banned the employment of women as clerks in the way that the Commonwealth Public Service did, there was an unofficial barrier which meant that almost no women were appointed to these roles. The exception again was during the World Wars, but that was on a strictly temporary basis. And that pretty much continued until the 1960s and 70s. Meanwhile, the number of typists exploded and a new role emerged, that of the secretary. The secretary usually combined typing with the ability to take dictation using shorthand. This too was learned first at business schools and then in secondary schools as well. Soon, training to be a secretary or a typist was one of the main occupational goals of young middle-class girls. Along with teaching and nursing, it was seen as being an appropriate women's occupation before marriage. The secretary was almost by definition female, and she was often sexualized in popular culture. Women's magazines and women's fiction often featured the secretary, who was invariably young, pretty, possibly efficient, but that wasn't really the focus of the game, and often in the stories hopelessly in love with her handsome boss, whom she usually married in the end. Marriage was always the end game for the fictional secretary. Women's magazines even openly debated whether the secretary should have what was called sex appeal, and they usually concluded that it was a distinct advantage. By the 1950s, thousands of women worked in offices as typists and as secretaries. Often they worked in so-called typing pools like this one, where work was distributed by a head typist, an older woman sometimes feared by typists and clerks alike. It was the head typist who determined the priority order of work and checked its quality. And she often had a de facto role in shielding her charges from the unwanted advances of the clerks too. Along with the secretaries and the typists came other office employees. Tea ladies first appeared after the Second World War and were soon fixtures of many workplaces. They delivered tea and coffee and often biscuits to workers at their desks, which avoided the need for workers to leave their desks for breaks, and it also saved employers from having to provide canteens for workers. Tea ladies were usually very popular, and they often knew more about the office than anyone else. The other common office employee was the lift operator. At first, these were all men, and they were often known simply as lift men. As Melbourne's skyline crept ever upwards in the 20th century, the number of lifts and lift men proliferated. The department stores all employed lift operators too, but some of those began to be young women after the Second World War, employed more to help customers navigate the store than to operate the machinery. All of these workers flooded into the city in the morning, returning home at night. And here is peak hour at Flinders Street Station in the 1940s. Public transport was crowded with office workers and shop assistants, and their routines determined the rhythms of the city. Evenings were given over to entertainment as before. But in the end, the office was no more proof against job losses associated with technological change than any other sector. In the 1970s, the word processor first came onto the scene, followed in the 1980s by the desktop computer. Computers, once associated with huge mainframe machinery housed in research institutes and large government departments, shrank in size to the desk level, but with their processing capacity undiminished. And all of a sudden, a new term entered the lexicon of the office: multitasking. Suddenly, the typist and the secretary found their jobs under threat, while clerks, now almost inevitably called something far grander, were expected to type their own letters and manage their own filing. Shock, horror. Then, from about the 1990s, email began to spread around offices, followed by mobile phones and texting, eventually swamping most other forms of office communication. And soon the typing pools were empty and the secretaries were an endangered species. Thousands of women lost their jobs in these decades, along with other office workers, like the switchboard operators, the much-loved tea ladies, and the lift attendants. Some department stores kept their lift attendants until the turn of the 21st century, but as automatic lifts took over, they too vanished. Few of these workers found alternative ongoing positions, and the numbers of casualised part-time workers increased. The modern office is a very different, much leaner place. Individual offices went the way of the typewriter in many offices, and soon there was debate about whether office workers even needed individual desks. Hot desking was much in vogue not so many years ago, with employees lugging around laptops and creating a, quote, office wherever they could find a space. This all came to an abrupt halt with COVID, of course. All of a sudden, these ultra-modern office setups were infection traps, and the office emptied along with the city. Melbourne stood deserted. Now, it's too soon to know what the post-COVID office will look like. Although employers are now trying very hard to entice their workers back into the office, egged on by the restaurant industry, there's a good deal of reluctance. Workers have discovered the advantages of working from home, with its gains for family life and work-life balance. And it seems possible that the office of the future may be just as much a virtual as a physical space. What all this means for the city is another matter. But scenes like this overcrowded Flinders Street Station are unlikely to appeal for the foreseeable future. Thanks very much. There we are. Thank you very much.
Now, while everyone types their questions into the Q&A, and Margaret takes a much needed breath, I'm sure, I'll let you know that our next free talk will be with Dr. Andrew Dodd on JJ Clark, the young architect of the beautiful Old Treasury building. This talk was being presented on May the 19th at 11 a.m. and it's in celebration of the building's 160th year of operation. In fact, the 19th is actually on the day that the building has its through, which is quite exciting. Tickets for that are available on our website and through Eventbrite. And for those interested in visiting the building, this coming Monday, we open a temporary exhibition, Behind the Lines, the best political cartoons from last year. Now, while everyone types, I have a question. Maggie, you said that 15 shillings was a good wage for someone working on the street. How did that compare with the average male wage at the time?
Well, very much lower, of course. Remember that a lot of the traders were children, and 15 shillings was probably about what the child street sweepers were paid. So as a child wage, it wasn't bad. But the Harvester judgment, the very famous decision of the arbitration court in 1907, which effectively set what was the basic wage for male workers, was 42 shillings a week. So that gives you some idea. Now, that was supposedly to allow a man to support a wife and 3 children. And 42 shillings was meant to assure that a worker could house them with some level of decency. But that's a fair indication. So not much, in other words.
No way. And those poor 2 boys who were looking after was it 3 siblings? And
oh, those little boys, yes, I very much doubt they made anything like 15 shillings. And that was a bit earlier too, but even so, I know they're terrible stories, some of those, and there were just so many little children. The little girls who were selling newspapers and flowers, they were often helping to support widowed mothers who couldn't leave the home because they had small children. And some of those stories are really just awful. Yeah.
I bet.
Was a Melbourne could be a very hard place, and if you were poor and female, you were in a particularly bad place.
Thank goodness we live today, eh?
No, not at all. No, this is all pre-welfare, of course. Well, yeah, the pension comes in the 20th century, but certainly pre-welfare. Some of the people are asking, I see on the chat, thanks for the nice comments, asking, is the exhibition still on? Yes, it is. So please come in and have a look.
And we've got the exhibition for some time as well.
Yes, we do. We'll leave it in place because we're still recovering from COVID and the numbers of people coming in are still quite low. We're leaving it in place until the end of next year, probably.
Mm. And of course, we'll be having some more talks around the topic as well over the next year or so.
Yes, we will. I might do one on children, I'm thinking, although there might be a little bit of overlap, so forgive me for that.
So another question's come in. How did people send money back to the family in their home countries? Was that quite common back, I suppose, 19th century?
Yeah, it was. They used to send things like money orders. And that was quite common, but of course it was risky because if the ship went down or whatever, people could lose their money orders, and so they didn't always make it. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A, Katie, but I'll let you manage those.
No worries. Were such big changes usually driven by economic, social, or even charitable factors?
Well, it varied from industry to industry. Charitable factors, not very often. Economic, social, absolutely, along with technology. And even the decline that we're talking about of the factories, it's a combination of many things, as I said, and the state of the global economy was one of the major ones. The rise of the Asian market, rising oil prices. I mean, it's just a sort of perfect storm of global economic factors that led to that decline, along with the removal of protection at the same time. So it was a completely impossible sort of economic environment for Australia's manufacturing to negotiate. But of course, we now can see the disadvantages of that. We see how vulnerable a place like Australia can be if there's a major crisis. And that crisis could include security crises too. And I think we've all become much more aware of that in the last few years. So, I mean, there are attempts now to try and stimulate a local manufacturing industry, and I think in Victoria to try and revive what was once a very strong chemical industry. And right from the beginning of the 20th century, right through until after the Second World War, Victoria had a very large chemical industry. So all of these things, it will be interesting to see whether governments manage to revive those industries.
Definitely. Just a comment about the hordes of people at the stations.
Yes.
We think of it as quite a common phenomena, but seeing, you know, from the 1940s,
I know, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, if anything, it looks worse than we all remember Flinders Street pre-COVID, and we all remember how awful it could be actually on those hugely crowded trains, you know, jam-packed, cheek by jowl with everybody standing up for long trips. We all remember that. But I don't know that I remember it being quite as bad as that photograph. So maybe there weren't as many trains. Maybe more people were using them. I don't know, but it's extraordinary, isn't it? And there are so many photographs of people flooding out of Flinders Street in the morning and returning at night. So a very common experience in the city.
And of course, much less cars on the road. And worse infrastructure for them, of course.
Yes, probably in the 1940s, certainly, people still would have been riding bicycles to work. Lots of people did. From the late 19th century, that was very, very common. So many of the workers who lived in the city either walked or rode bicycles to work. Bicycles were probably more common than any means of transport. So many of the people coming in and out of the city on public transport possibly came from the suburbs. And we're travelling bigger distances. Now, hence the depopulation. When factories move out to the fringes of Melbourne, then the workers had to go too, because there was no choice, effectively.
Well, I'll have to think about. Well, there doesn't seem to be any more questions. So thank you again, Margaret, and thanks to everyone who tuned in. We hope to see you on the 19th of May for JJ Clark with Dr. Andrew Dodd. And just a reminder that the museum is currently open from 10 till 12 and 1 till 3 on Sundays through Fridays. So thank you very much, and I hope everyone has a lovely day.
Thanks very much, everybody. Bye.